Hello everyone, thanks for having me. It's a really great opportunity to come and talk to people other than just from the alcohol field, and not just talking about alcohol policy, but trying to take methods and the things that we do and think about how they can be applied elsewhere. Obviously, as you've heard, we've been focused on violence for a very long time, and particularly about ways to reduce violence and associated alcohol-related harm. I think one of the figures that never seems to get in the media is that in fact more people suffer injury related to alcohol consumption than violence, but it's always the violence that gets in there, and they're always talking about the perpetrators rather than the victims. But when we actually talk about our research, what we show is alcohol makes you much more likely to be a victim beyond but more likely to being a perpetrator. I'm not getting off topic because I think you guys actually deal with a lot of the same issues of people wanting to always focus in the wrong sorts of area, or focus on things they can't change rather than what they can change. And that's often, I can see that in gambling issues as well as in alcohol issues. I've tried in this talk to really cover off and talk about what we did and what are our key findings. I'm not sure how interested you'll be in the key findings, but I hope you find them vaguely interesting. But much more than that, I've spent a lot more time than I normally would on the methods, just so that you get a sense of the technicalities of what we did. I need to acknowledge my many collaborators. This is only for the key project I'm talking about today, which is patron offending, intoxication in nighttime entertainment districts. As you can see, there was 7 other institutions involved as well across Australia, and it's currently being replicated in another 3 cities. So it's really great to sort of come up with a design that is then used again and again and again. And there's some really key people here, particularly the 2 police inspectors. You see, Bill Mathers was a major driving force behind both of the really big nightlife projects we did. And it was one of those issues of bringing people who are practically involved in the policy implications of what we do into research. So Bill was a great partner in all of that, and we'd known each other since the days that I was the head bouncer at the Geelong Hotel and he was the beat cop. So having that relationship over sort of 30 years and knowing that we both dealt with the same people on some nights helped a lot. So what did we do? So patron appointed study, we looked into 129 venues across Australia. I've put the observations first, but we actually also spoke to over 7,000 people across the nighttime economy. So this is just this study, as was mentioned before. We've also done now 3 other studies, and we're up to about 13,000 people overall. It's good we've only had 1 adverse incident over that whole period of 6 years of data collection, which is quite interesting. You think about 13,000 interactions with drunk people. But the key thing is we're sober and we're looking out. Again, it talks a little bit about it. I'll move on to the more straightforward one. Our sample, obviously, Melbourne, Geelong, Sydney, Wollongong, Perth. The 3 biggest cities, or 3 of the biggest cities in Australia, certainly Melbourne and Sydney were really important to get a hold of. We wanted to be able to compare them to regional cities. We had ongoing data collection in Geelong, so that made sense. And Wollongong rather than the previous study, which had been in Newcastle. Newcastle has 3 AM trading restrictions. You may have heard about them in the news over the last 5 years. Everybody's trying to ignore them at the moment. The Hotels Association are again pushing out, oh no, it doesn't work, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We've got a bit of evidence about that. And we also thought Perth was an important place to get. I think also in terms of gambling, it's really interesting and important to look at, because they've only got pokies in one place, in one venue. So it's fascinating to try to look at that. But for us, it was particularly important because they have 1 large entertainment district, very heavy ratio of males, very much more cashed up. So quite an interesting place to look at. Sorry, I sort of mentioned sorry, I sort of mentioned the different cities and didn't really talk about the number of venues and the times we were looking at them for. The key thing is for most of the places we went out until 7 AM or till as late a trading as possible for both observations and interviews. After 4 AM there was not much point doing interviews, both because of the levels of intoxication, but also the number of people who would even vaguely engage. The streets were quite empty. Even King Street was, by 5 AM, there was really nobody who was talking to you at our wall. They were just stumbling. past. But key in this was also some of the differences, and Wollongong was a really interesting one that I haven't put up there. But really in Wollongong, you'll often hear discussion around Wollongong reducing harm and not having as great a level of harm, but effectively they shut at 1 a.m. So there's one nightclub, it's really quite a dive. I hope that doesn't get on the presentation. I'll probably get sued or something again. And but nobody really goes there. So quite really realistically, Wollongong actually shuts at 1 a.m. So they're important site differences that we need to consider when trying to think about doing large multi-site trials. So onto the fun pictures. Covert venue observations. Now we'd done a number of variations in the previous study, which was comparing Geelong and Newcastle over a couple of years, and we benefited from that in terms of the methodology we came up with. In the Dante study, we essentially ran between venues. So we did an hour observation in one place and then went to another place and did the same sort of structured observation. And we really found that didn't allow us to get a sense of what was happening in a venue over the whole period. So for pointed, we stayed in the one place and we took hourly observations on top of other stuff, and we'll get to that in a minute. Key in that is pairs of groups or groups of researchers, partially so they felt safe, but also it's quite easy for 2 or 3 people to stand around and completely blend in. Even, up until a year or two ago, I looked very young. But I could go in and there was no really odd questions or anything. I don't think I'd quite make it these days. I've decided my observation days are over. We used iPhones primarily, so if the staff had an iPhone already, we would simply upload. We've got a form called Tap Forms. It's commercially available, $9, and you can put it on all the devices you can imagine. But we also had about 40 iPods for different places that, in case people's phones didn't work, or the odd exception didn't actually have an iPhone. Where possible, we found male-female pairs worked best. From the Dante study, where we actually even went out to places like strip joints, sometimes female-female pairs got a lot more unacceptable or not so positive attention. And the male-male pairs could also often experience the same sort of stuff. We found male-female pairs by far the best combination, or 3 in, 1 male and 2 females. It tended to work a lot better, and in the end it is about functionality of research as well. It's about getting your teams out there and wanting to go out next week, because if you do something like the Dante study, we're collecting data for 2 years and people give up their Saturday night, so you kind of want people to keep going back. I know it's their job, but it's also about them enjoying their job too. As gathered, people, we just blended in. We dressed as normal sort of patrons, and importantly, our researchers didn't collect the same data. So as you can imagine, most nightclubs or bars actually have separate bars in separate areas. So we would generally station ourselves essentially on one side of the door and the other side of the door, and be looking in, ideally looking over the bars so we could see what was being consumed. You'll see why in a minute. But so we treated each independent observation as being completely independent, because they were usually looking at different sections of the same pub, which, as you know, sometimes you can have one area completely chock-a-block and another area absolutely empty. Sorry for this really busy slide. Life's been a bit busy, and normally I can inflate it down and make it a bit nicer, but it's a bit busy, this one. So as I mentioned before, we went out somewhere between 10 a.m. and 7 a.m, got 6 a.m. there, and generally observations lasted for about 4 hours. We find people get too tired in that sort of environment after about 5 hours, and we generally left it a bit up to the researchers, particularly that last hour. If you're getting on to 5 a.m. and you're not really concentrating very well, there's danger issues, there's all that sort of stuff where you just go, safety is ultimately more important. But the average, certainly the minimum, was 4 hours data collection. Each team, as I mentioned, visited one place, and observations were conducted unobtrusively. We gave extensive safety training, but it's not actually that long. It's not that hard to tell people how to be safe in nighttime environments. It really takes about 30 minutes to give them the key instructions, and then after that there's documents they can go away and read, but really the instructions are quite straightforward. And I'll cover the checklists in a minute. And researchers also carried information cards. So on the off chance that they got caught, which we never did, but on the off chance they got caught, they had a card that they were instructed to hand to whoever and say, we're conducting a study, we're leaving now, and literally walk straight out the door, ignoring all statements and everything else. So there was quite a clear protocol around, if you get caught, you start walking towards the door, you hand it over, the other people, you never leave your partners. And that worked really well. We thought it worked really well, but we never actually got to test it. So what did it look like? So the forms that people were actually filling in. So these are just, you'll see a lot of these screenshots from the iPhone, as you can sort of tell. And this is what it looked like. So the observers would simply come up with the iPhone and select one of these different options. The standard hourly form, obviously, you started filling in every hour. You had group tracking forms, which we'll show you in a minute, and then the incident reports. So incident reports are about people using energy drinks, which is why we were looking over the bars. So we were actually following people who were drinking energy drinks, because that was one of our key areas of interest. And then if we saw physical violence, non-physical sort of violence, or any sort of sexual violence. The hourly report form looks like this. It takes about 10 minutes to complete, and it covers a range of different issues, particularly generally around the venue. So things like, as you can see, roughly how many people are in the venue at this time. People are actually quite good at estimating. It's not that hard to count if you're sitting there and just doing a rough count. Again, it averages out. If you think about doing 1,000 observations over a whole year, it averages out whether you over or underestimate. What's the capacity and how full is the venue? So what sort of capacity you're at. Percentage males is a really important variable for us in violence. It's one of the biggest predictors of alcohol-related violence, and the percentages of people under the age of 25, as you can imagine. And then also we looked at what are the main types of alcohol being consumed, as you can imagine. Probably not so much interest to you, but it was quite, we thought it might be of interest to us. However, we didn't actually find it was terribly impactful at all. Again, we also looked at alcohol promotions, which may be more interesting for you in terms of gambling promotions as well, so we recorded that. The beauty of using iPods and iPhones, you can also take photos. So we could actually photograph what are the promotions going on. We could even record certain things if we really felt like doing that in the voice recorder. It was all very easy to do and interactive. And as you can see, we also asked a bit about energy drinks. One of the more fun parts was looking at groups. I think it's the next one where you must, yeah. So we also tracked groups throughout a time, because one of the key issues is it groups of young men who are creating violence, groups of young women who are creating violence? What are the different dynamics sort of going on? So we had to come up with a way of how do we follow these people? How do we do it systematically? So we gave them unique names and tried to have some memory aids. And we specifically also tracked groups with the same sort of form around energy drinks. So there you can see some of our names for the different groups. There's a number, it was kind of a focus group of all the research assistants coming up with all these different names. Terribly, terribly inappropriate, never be published in an academic journal. I think I got the last, I think the last category was especially for me. So the task was pretty in terms of people sitting in a nightclub and filling in all this data. So a little bit of fun like this. Okay, so am I looking for the bogans or am I looking for the bros or that sort of thing? I mean, a little bit more fun. As you can see, the other ones became a little bit more serious. We looked at signs of illicit drug use. You'd be surprised how many signs you actually pick up when you're looking for them. Paraphernalia, people sort of intoxicated but obviously not drinking, those sorts of things. And then what sort of drugs they might be using. And you can do that through things like going into toilets and seeing bits of tabs or little fish containers like the old soy sauce and things like that. And then we had more specific things around what are the types of groups, who are these people with, what are they up to, etc., etc. Obviously, one of the key things is following people around and then tracking them. So what happened to them, and in the end, did they create a problem, and were they asked to leave, or did staff have to intervene? So this is one of the key screens that we had that became an outcome that we were really looking at in terms of that. And as you can see in most of these, you'll note that there's an other down the bottom. So so for all of these, we could actually enter in text as well. And that's not hard to do. Again, it simply looks like you're texting your friend and maybe writing a bit of an essay, but you can text in, or you can put in quite a lot of text quite adequately about describing all of those situations that don't fit within the preordained categories. Again, energy drinks, and then what sort of combination were people doing with energy drinks? But there's no data on that. There's never been any data on that. So for us, it was an important part of our collection. And then what else are they doing with it? Because most people have a Jaeger bomb, so Jägermeister mixed with Red Bull, and then they actually follow it up with something else. So it's about how they actually drink this over time. Or a lot of people buy Red Bull and vodka and actually sit there and sip it. So consumption patterns matter as much as what's being consumed. The incident reports were different again, and obviously we were thinking primarily about physical violence. Interestingly, the numbers came out quite small, as you'll see, but we really wanted to document what happened, and then we could follow these people up over time. So we could, once we'd opened an incident report, it's very easy to go back to again and again and again, same as the groups. So we could follow, let's say two guys bumped into each other, obviously had a bit of push and shove. We could go and follow those guys over the course of the night, over the course of an hour, see if it resolved or see if it didn't resolve or it escalated and what possibly happened. So that allowed us to follow that big variation of things that happen in such a complex social environment. This study has massive limitations. Every study has massive limitations, and it's really important, I feel, to be clear about that. As we know, some people can take, particularly we're finding in the alcohol industry right now, they're doing a lot of picking up a limitation section and saying you must ignore this complete study because it has limitations. So that's an important one to be able to address. However, it's important to note that we did. Ultimately, we were only in those venues for 4 to 5 hours. Now, some of them trade from 10 p.m. till 7 a.m. and there's simply a resource and personal fatigue element that comes into it about how long you can spend in there. So we may not have seen everything, and I think that's key. We're actually doing a couple of studies. We've finally been able to, after 4 or 5 years, getting CCTV camera footage off streets. So everybody's worried about, it's odd that somehow the authorities are worried about us getting CCTV footage of people acting on the streets, doing stuff on the streets. But we're now able to do that. But without CCTV footage, obviously, it's quite hard to say we captured every event because things can always happen outside your view. And unless you're 7 foot tall and can look down, there's often things that will happen outside your vision. But we do think by visiting venues on multiple occasions and at different times. So if we'd been to a venue at 10 p.m. till 2 a.m, we would make sure we'd go back and visit it. And generally we visited every venue at least 4 times, so that we tended to be able to at least moderate that by some. Obviously, if you had unlimited resources, you'd go there constantly and you would do it throughout the night and maybe have 2 teams of observers. As I mentioned, overall we did almost 900 observations across the country. And we split it reasonably well across bar type venues, the smaller type venues, nightclubs and mainstream pubs. Obviously nightclubs were the key one, but in many cities there's not as many nightclubs as you would have thought, and one of the big issues was particularly around these mainstream pubs that tend to feed later trading nightclubs. Oh, that looks, yeah, you can just see that, sorry. So these are the sort of key variables here about what's happening. I think some of the trends are quite interesting in terms of throughout the night you tend to see escalations in the sort of capacity of the venues, which peaks for nightclubs around 2 a.m, which is interesting because you hear this constant fight for longer and longer trading hours or against restriction of trading hours. But what we actually found was these venues are declining after 2 a.m. The numbers are going down, and that's right across Australia. Percentage of males increases throughout the night. Level of intoxication increases throughout the night. So all of it's not just about intoxication, it's about all these other predictors of trouble that tend to increase throughout the night. So it's important to be able to document those different factors that happen as the night gets later. Because the sensible girls went home a long time ago. Levels of intoxication, and that's really where most of our findings have been reported, and a key. Our observers were asked to allocate overall ratings of patron intoxication. Obviously, they're subjective, but we used clear measures. All of our observers were trained in responsible service of alcohol, so they all had their certificates and they'd all been recently trained, so that was fresh in their mind, and they were using the key criteria that bar staff or security should be using as well. So that for us was an important criteria, so that we weren't describing something different. And we obviously used 4 different sort of levels: low, medium, high or no signs of intoxication. And as you can see, they vary somewhat. The fairly predictable one is high intoxication, which starts off almost at 0 at 10 p.m, which is actually saying something quite positive in some ways, that there are very low levels of high intoxication in pubs at about 10 p.m. So that's a reasonably positive statement. But as you can see, that increases, and it starts to increase a lot more as you get later into the night. Obviously, we also have our objective data on that if I was presenting the patron interviews, because we caught them as they came out of the pubs as well. So, you know, that's another story, another talk. But we do have findings that back that up. I think the medium intoxication one's really interesting, because that's where most of your population sits, is they get reasonably intoxicated, and it is about midnight. So we have other data from breathalyzer data that shows very clearly there's a significant difference in the level of people who are heavily intoxicated before and after midnight. So if you're ever talking about, I know probably not your field, but if you're ever talking about what time pubs should shut or what time people should start talking about pub shutting, it's midnight where everything actually changes. It's not 2 a.m, it's not 3 a.m. It's not to say it's when the pub should shut, but that's when you should start the discussion, and then about how much further you want. Because we know you get about a 15 to 20% increase in harm for every hour after midnight. So it's midnight that's the starting point. The witching hour, indeed. Intoxication ratings per venue. As you can see, larger proportion of highly intoxicated patrons in nightclubs. No great surprise there. They trade later, and they have a much greater interest in terms of people who are already intoxicated coming from everybody else. And it was really across all levels of patron intoxication increased over time across all venues. So there wasn't different trends in different types of venues. As you can see, by 2 a.m, about 70% of the patrons were showing some form of intoxication. Now that's any one sign, so that could be slurring your words like I am now, stumbling, tripping over, spilling your drinks, being raucous, and then there's a whole lot of others that are not official signs of intoxication, but we also recorded. They didn't make it into this analysis. And then there's 10 to 25% appeared too intoxicated to remain in venues. Now, too intoxicated is 3 of those signs. So when you're showing 3 of those signs, obviously you're too intoxicated. Now there's a paper, what is it? It's been accepted, it hasn't been published yet, where we can map the signs of intoxication to the level of BAC. It's about 0.12. So you're at 0.12 when you're on average, when you're showing 3 signs of intoxication. Anybody been to 0.1 recently that they know of? Last year, my students were doing a subject where we got people intoxicated in an office, in my office, and we met. So we were measuring intoxication. We've got some new whiz-bang machines trying to measure impairment rather than intoxication, because it's really important, particularly later at night. The students needed one more person. I put my hand up. They did the equation. There's an equation from the 60s that says you need to drink this much to get intoxicated. 14 standard vodkas for a fellow who's 120 kilos. That's drunk, let me tell you. And you had to drink it in half an hour.
Oh my God. You didn't throw up?
Yeah. Sorry?
You didn't throw up?
No, but there was some people who did. And we actually ran the same experiment last weekend in a slightly different format. And it's ongoing, but I'm no longer participating. We've got my data. So Point one is heavily intoxicated. When we're talking heavily intoxicated, that's how drunk we're talking. We're not talking mildly intoxication. Oh, I feel a little bit tipsy. No, point one is really out there. Overall, right across Australia, we saw in the 6-month data collection period, 208 incidents of those people ordering drinks, and 84.6%, sorry I forgot the percentage sign, of people who showed those signs subsequently were served alcohol. So we make pretty strong conclusions about that in the report, saying, you know, this is not really what you call acceptable. But it's difficult across the whole country. I think one of the things we talk about it in the report where we got a lot of space to discuss, but really importantly, we saw so many people stagger down the street, get to the corner, sober up, walk up to the security. They could hold it together for 3 minutes, no problems. They practice. Same at the bar. So an important part of responsible service of alcohol and monitoring that and being able to manage it is actually about finding other ways than those two critical points where people can pull it together for a minute or two and act sober enough to buy a drink or to get past security. Because the current measures we have and those 2 points of evaluation are obviously not long enough and not thorough enough, particularly if you're talking about 4 deep at a bar. And as you can see, here's sort of the frequency ratings of levels of intoxication. And it's just really reiterating what I'm saying in terms of nightclubs showing the higher levels. But bars and mainstream pubs are certainly not out of the picture at all. And there's that figure again in comparison to all of the other outcomes. So it's a pretty overwhelming sort of response. The very 8% were refused service and asked to leave. That's important. It's good. You've got to acknowledge good practice. And we saw lots of good practice. It's not like we didn't see good practice. It's just that these numbers tend to get a bit overwhelming when you're talking about that many. Just because we studied it and because you gave me, 40 minutes, 50 minutes. Alcohol and energy drinks, it's hot topic. Red Bull's just released another study saying, no, there's nothing there, don't go there, don't look. What we found was, interestingly, that the observers who were witnessing people consuming alcohol and energy drinks, we saw a lot of it. So about a quarter, and interestingly, that's virtually the same as self-report. So about a quarter of people out there in nighttime economies are mixing alcohol and energy drinks. We know from the patron interviews that they tend to report higher, significantly more dangerous behaviours. So they're more likely to get into fights, they're significantly more likely to end up in the emergency department, more likely to drink drive home, and they're more likely to engage in any form of assault, so sexual assault as well. So they basically tick the boxes on all of the more dangerous behaviours. There's some great other questions we can get into if you ever want to about this. It's quite a complex area. But what we did find inside venues were that those venues that had people who were using more energy drinks and where it was more popular and more promoted, they were actually more intoxicated on the rating scales as well. So there's a really interesting correlation there between the two. Causality is a really difficult, almost impossible thing to improve in such a complex environment. But certainly, places where the consumers were using more energy drinks, we found much higher levels of intoxication. And that really just backs it up to show you what sort of levels we're talking about. So the higher levels of intoxication, you're looking at, almost a third of people, just over a quarter, let's say. Illicit substances were also really important for us. I don't know how much they apply for you guys in the gambling sector and whether it has a big impact or a small impact. We had about 200 hourly records, so about 22% of observations found some sort of form of illicit drug use. I didn't mention it, but in the patron interviews we did, we actually drug swabbed 500 people in Melbourne and Geelong, a random selection. Should have seen the ethics application, it was about that thick. But it was, what was really important for us is that this is a really big issue in licensed venues, and it was across all licensed venues. There were some that we were getting up towards 70-80%, the guaranteed across level is between 20 and 40%. We had 20% who refused to take the test. We're pretty confident you don't refuse a test unless you have been using. 20% tested positive, and those tests only picked up the main drugs, so amphetamine type substances, including MDMA, cocaine, cannabis, opiates, benzos, but it didn't pick up GHB, ketamine, methadone, all of the LSD. So all of those had about 1% people self-reporting on top of that. So we're actually really close to 50% of people in nighttime economies using illicit substances. Now that, I think, possibly has implications for the responsible service of gambling as well, so we could talk about that a bit more. And there you see the figures again. What was interesting was we picked up a lot more in Melbourne than we did in Sydney, Geelong, Perth or Wollongong. Wollongong, we tend to think that there was a bit of a site bias there because there are much more pubs and far less of a culture. And Melbourne, the only real explanation we can come up with, because we don't see any change, any real differences in the patron testing sort of data, was really that our observers may have been more cued into signs of drug use. So they came from a drug research institute and they'd been doing much more ethnography in and around pubs to monitor drug use already. So that's how we think we got that figure. I'll skip that one. Physical incident observations. I think the key thing is to look at the bottom and to see the very small numbers. So again, when you're out there doing nighttime economy stuff and saying we're going to observe these incidents, in fact you need to be out there a lot to see violent incidents. You wouldn't get that if you just read the front page of the papers, because they only need one incident to make the front page every week. But to get those incidents sitting inside pubs, we found it was really low, about 6% overall, and only 14 separate incidents over 1,000 observations. So very small in terms of that. There were higher rates in Perth than anywhere else, which pretty much matches up with everything else, and then Geelong was sort of up there as well. Again, in terms of percentages, we really saw nightclubs as being the place where we saw most of the physical incidents. But again, the numbers are too small to make any sort of really strong conclusions about that. To conclude, particularly compared to somebody who's been out doing patron interviews and a number of other types of studies, systematic observations are actually quite easy to conduct. If you get the right tools and the right training in place, they are very easy to conduct and they are low impact in terms of your staff wellbeing and things like that, and low danger. As you can see, they're a really powerful tool for documenting a few key outcomes, and I think that's the key thing, is identifying the outcomes you really want to measure and how you're going to document them. And there is the option very much these days for video and audio footage as well. I don't know if how much that applies to you in the gambling sector. I'm looking forward to those discussions. But for us, they are a very powerful tool for documenting things like levels of intoxication and staff and patron behaviour. As you saw, illicit drug use is really common, especially in nightclubs, but right across the board in terms of licensed venues, and I think we need to be having more discussions about that. That's not to say, and I need to say this really carefully, that's not to say the elephant in the room remains alcohol. It blows away all problems compared to illicit drugs, but illicit drugs remain significant predictors. So it's not, you don't say either or, you say both, but most of our energy still needs to be focused on alcohol. As I said, venues that serve energy drinks are much more likely to have higher average levels of intoxication, and it predicts individual behaviour as well. An example of policy implication or practice implication is that many police who have been involved in this research now see energy drink use as an indicator of problem behaviour. They don't see it as necessarily being the cause, but if you're out inside a venue and you're talking to people and somebody's using an energy drink, they see that as good cause to go and talk to that person to see how they're going, because they are more likely to get into some form of harm. So that's the way police have interpreted it. It's not an intervention per se, it's just them using as a cue to go and talk to those people. And I think, I'm pretty safe in concluding responsible service of alcohol laws are failing in our country right across the board. And we need far greater enforcement and understanding of the ways we can improve that sort of outcome. Thank you very much.